Welcome to What Kind of Asian Are You? A podcast featuring conversations about being Asian. We are going to highlight, amplify, and validate Asian voices through deep conversations with those in the diaspora making a difference and being their best selves. I'm your host, Kyle. And we have a very special guest today, and we're just going to get straight into the conversation. So today I welcome Johna onto the podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to join you this morning.
And because I know your background and all that stuff, and we're going to let the audience know as well, but this should be kind of a weird spot for you to be in because normally you're on the other side asking questions and all that stuff and what you do. So for the listeners, can you just let them know what you do, what you're all about, and your passions, and most importantly, with this podcast, what kind of Asian are you?
Yeah, sure. So I am a writer, an editor, a journalist based in Vancouver. I am a Philippine-born Filipino. I grew up in Hong Kong. So I like to say I'm a second generation Hong Kong immigrant, but a first generation immigrant to Canada. I moved here 3 years ago now. That's the nutshell version. Yeah.
Perfect. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on, not just because, I'm a fan of your work, what you do, what I see you put out, and it's also because that Hong Kong connection, because I was born in Hong Kong, but I immigrated to Canada when I was a kid. And that's
Um,
how I think our kind of spirit, our kind of world kind of connected because of like Hong Kong connection. So you mentioned like
mhm.
you were born in the Philippines and then you and your family moved to Hong Kong. So can you just talk about that kind of immigration journey? Because that's one kind of story, and then now you are in Canada, another immigration story. So can you just talk all about your experience first, and we'll go from
Yeah,
there?
yeah. Sure. I mean, that's cool to know. Yeah. I was born in the Philippines, but we moved to Hong Kong just before I turned one. And I grew up there. I lived there. My family lived there for almost 15 years before we migrated back to the Philippines, where I completed 1 year of high school and then university. And then I worked for like 2 years before I moved back to Hong Kong. And that's where I spent the next 7 years. Basically, a lot of my early career or my early professional life was in Hong Kong. And then after I got married, I moved to Canada to join my partner, who um, was formerly based in Montreal and then moved to Vancouver. So I've been based in Vancouver ever since. Hong Kong, I guess just the immigration aspect of it. I think when you are growing up, you don't really think about that. You assume everybody has a similar background as you. I went to a local school that had an English medium of teaching, and a lot of my classmates. Now I know we were all immigrant kids. We all spoke English, so I just kind of always assumed everybody had a home outside of Hong Kong or like another country they go back to during holidays, because my family would spend Christmases and New Year's in the Philippines. Almost once a year, once every 2 years or so. Um, and so that was, I guess, that was my immigrant experience as a kid. And then just before I turned 15, we moved back to the Philippines, and I think that's when I sort of started to realize that that's not really the case. That not, I think what I'm trying to say is that's when I understood that maybe being an immigrant in Hong Kong was not as common an experience as I thought. Um, I don't know if you feel this way, or I think I'm only speaking for myself, but I feel like there's a common experience here when you realize that, I'm back in the Philippines. I thought I'd fit in quite well, like right away, because I was Filipino. But that's not the case because then my upbringing was very different from a lot of my classmates that I went to high school, that 1 year of high school with. So that was interesting. It was around that time that I started to think of, um, or I started to realize there were very real differences that became the outcome of having grown up as an immigrant, almost as a third culture kid. And yeah, that's a lot of words. I'm sorry, but um, I think, and then going back to Hong Kong after 7 years in the Philippines, and entering the workforce, that I guess expanded my ideas around the different types of identities we do take on as immigrant kids, or depending on the context that we were in. I think what I'm trying to say is that because in the workplace, I was very visibly Filipino. I mean, in some of my work settings, I had colleagues that they described themselves as Hong Kong locals. It was very difficult to sort of convince them that I was a local and that I also grew up in Hong Kong, because my Cantonese is not very good, first of all, and then I also wasn't Chinese, like Hong Kong Chinese. And then there would be the Filipino church community circles that I'd also be a part of, and I think that's where a lot of the more cultural expectations would come up, and I'd have to assimilate, be the more Filipino part of myself in those circles. And then there were, I think, the friends that I chose and the friends that I made, and I would like to think, that was the context in which I felt, okay, I can, we can be together. We don't have to talk so much about, the cultural differences didn't come up. We were 20 somethings trying to figure out our place in Hong Kong, in the world, in our own work lives. Does that make sense? So, um, I would say those years when I returned to Hong Kong, all of those ideas were at the back of my head, just trying to understand what it meant to have these different identities. And I think moving to Canada, all of that just got amplified. All of a sudden, sure, I speak English, but I'm a quote unquote visible minority. Like I'm no longer in an Asian um, context or setting. And even though I speak in English, I recognize that the way I use the language may not necessarily be the same as the way a lot of the people I encounter here use the language. And it's not a bad thing. I think it's realizing, again, the many different layers, and the constant code switching we do depending on the context we're in. Yeah, that's a really long answer, but I hope that sort of gets to your question, gets to the heart of what you were trying to ask.
Yeah, that's very thorough and like
Yeah.
very eye opening because me as an immigrant to Canada when I was young, I don't have the same experience as you, even though both of us are immigrants to a different country of our
Hmm.
parents, and yours is a little different because you had I guess the opportunity where you were brought to Hong Kong when you were one, and you spent a lot of your like formative years there, and then
Yeah.
you went back to Philippines where you went through a big part of your life there as well with schooling and whatnot, and then going back to Hong Kong again, and then readapting, and but still feeling you belong there too because you were there for so long as well. Would you say that it
Yeah.
was kind of very interesting? I don't want to say confusing, but interesting kind of dynamic where I belong here, but people because I'm not Hong Kong Chinese, that add in another layer of it, like the belonging aspect and who you really are. That really, I wouldn't say bothered you, but very much like if people talk about identity, that's one of the things that would like shoot right up to you. Like, yeah, I know this kind of thing I can talk about, and like I don't have all the answers, maybe, but at least I have a strong opinion about it because I think a lot of like I said, I guess first generation kids to another country from their parents wouldn't have that kind of dilemma like yourself, when you can kind of recognize like the big differences that would have occurred because you went both places and back and such. So
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's constantly navigating. I mean, I'm sure your experiences were also very different coming to Canada, um, as a young kid too. You did spend a few years in Hong Kong, you said, right? So, I mean, I think it's interesting to me that we all have these experiences, and it's also very interesting that they're just very different. I mean, very different in nature, and in the angles through which we experience these different layers. So, yeah.
and I'm really interested in kind of your perspective because a lot of times when we talk about Hong Kong, a lot of people don't recognize it's a very homogenous kind of place where yeah, it's mainly Hong Kong Chinese, but you can't discredit there's a lot of the ethnic minorities that's there that from other Asian countries like Philippines, India,
Mm,
Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all that stuff. But it's often like under kind of reported, or just people don't find it that important, or like they don't even
hmm.
consider it, even though they are they should be considered like Hong Kong local, how they be there their whole lives and stuff. But it's often not the case. And I guess it become more of a kind of a topic now in 2022, when it's more looked upon like, oh, there are a lot of like ethnic minorities in Hong Kong that they would consider themselves as Hong Kongers, but outside
Mm,
the world look they don't get that kind of label, or like the locals are they are still kind of really slow on like kind of recognizing that they are like us. They are. It's just that we're not of the same kind of cultural background, but like identity wise, it's still very Hong Kong. So, what are your thoughts on
mm.
that? Because I have a lot of thoughts being Hong Kong Chinese, seeing how it is. Because I hear things and family members and a lot of stuff. So it's interesting to hear your
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot there to unpack what you just said. I want to, like being an adult, being a grown up and understanding these things more. It's very different to when I was a kid, just kind of going through it, assuming that was very normal. So I would say, like, I think I said this earlier when I was going to school there, I assumed everybody was an immigrant. Maybe I didn't use the word immigrant. I just assumed, oh, everybody has like a different other country, aside from Hong Kong, that they call home. Um, I had a lot of classmates that were from India, from Nepal, from Pakistan. I had a lot of Filipino classmates as well. And then I, you know, I just assumed that was Hong Kong. Um, but when you're older, and I think also I started to see the the I feel like class is a very, very um, it's a hard word to sort of unpack and unwrangle, because it brings a lot of discomfort, right? I feel like it's in bringing that up, I acknowledge what my privileges were, and I acknowledge that my privileges may have come at a cost of somebody else's access to opportunities. But I think what I'm trying to say is, when I got a bit older, I realized there was a very dominant idea of what a Filipino looked like. And there was also a very, maybe a clearer idea of what it meant to be a Hong Kong Chinese. He spoke Cantonese. He understood the language, the culture, and I think I had a little bit of that Hong Kong part. Like, I don't speak it, but I can understand what's going on in a room when people are speaking the language. And I can order food. But I I thought very it was very difficult, on the one hand, wanting to assert that there is nothing wrong with the dominant uh, the stereotype of what a Filipino is, because a lot of it is based on truth. But then there are so many other walks of life from that background too that exist, and that goes for everybody else from other cultures that you meet in Hong Kong, right? So I think it's really um, I think it's really important to recognize that people can be of a place and look what like one of many different iterations of that place. And saying that, I think I've been very fortunate in that. How do I put this? I did go to a local school, and I don't know how to describe this. I feel really uncomfortable saying that I went to local school, but sometimes people would ask me, "Did you? Oh, you went to an international school in Hong Kong?" And that makes me question, like, why what gives you that idea? And I think in saying that, there's a lot of ideas around as well, in the way we use the English language in giving off certain ideas or impressions to other people. And I think about that, all I want to say is that um, I'm a bit more understanding now why people might have that idea, but I also wish to iterate that um, we work very hard in Hong Kong. We all do what we can to, do well in school, do well in our jobs, and sometimes certain things like in the workplace. Like would have to maybe the later part of my work where I had a lot of colleagues that were also expats. You also have to work very hard to be able to communicate with them in certain ways, right? So there, I feel like that's very unwieldy, and I just went through different rabbit holes. But all of that to say, I feel and I think a lot about these things, and also coming from Hong Kong, I really consider it my home. Obviously, I consider Philippines home as well. Um, but yeah, I totally get it that sometimes I have to work a bit harder in explaining or trying to describe why I consider it home. Does that make sense?
Sorry to interrupt the podcast, but if this is a podcast that is bigger, this would be the time where we would be selling an ad for either a pillow, a subscription box, or online therapy, but we're not there yet. However, if businesses want us to do an ad for them, we are more than happy to do so. Just reach out to us. In the meantime, this is our time to say that you, the listeners, mean a lot to us. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can do that by listening, commenting, liking, and subscribing to the podcast on all social media platforms, as well as giving us a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We are at What Kind of Asian Pod on Instagram, and just search What Kind of Asian Are You podcast for everything else. And if you have $1 or two to spare, buy me a coffee. Links in show notes. Now back to the episode. Totally. And going back to like, oh yeah, you went to a local school and English was a primary language. I just like from my knowledge, like it's quite interesting and kind of frustrating. Well, how I see it is like
Mm,
how you have other people or like students that are not mainly Hong Kong Chinese or what like non-Chinese kind of ethnicity, and that you like they want to still assimilate all that stuff, but that you making it where like it's not really a like a requirement that their Cantonese is up to a certain level. It's where you could just let them learn English and then whatever Cantonese they learn, as long as it's passable in their mindset, then it's good. But I think if you want them to assimilate, the best way one of them is through language, and because
absolutely.
it would be weird if say for me when I immigrated to Canada, say oh under normal circumstances I need to learn the English language of course, or French if it's in Montreal as well.
Hmm.
Imagine if I came here and then they assume I'm this, so therefore I don't need to learn this, I just learn whatever language no, it's easier for me and that's it. So that I can't
Yeah,
be like everyone else in the normal mainstream society. I think that's kind of interesting and why the system was set in place in terms of these ethnic minority schools in Hong Kong, and just not letting them the opportunity. Like I think there's a lot of like push that needs to be done if you really want to like
hmm,
go beyond that. And I think it's unfair to uh make people that are belong in the Hong Kong have to take that extra step. If that makes sense.
yeah, yeah. I feel like you hit the nail on the head. I am only now understanding that there was um, that sort of segregation, right? For like kids who weren't necessarily Hong Kong Chinese. We were all put in this one class, and then we had Chinese as a second language. But the immersion was zero. I don't know enough about it to be able to talk about it at length, but I know, I have a lot of friends who say, I really regret not learning Cantonese more growing up. And that being said, I also have a lot of friends who picked up the language and can use it, like um, as a local Hong Konger would, even if they're not necessarily Chinese, and that's great for them. But um, I do feel it's such a missed opportunity, I speak for myself. I do think it's a missed opportunity that I didn't immerse in the language as much as I could have. Um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it just I have heard or know of stories where like ethnic minorities in Hong Kong where they were like, oh, my first really interaction with like classmates or like people that I can get closer to is that are Hong Kong Chinese would be when they started university at Hong Kong University, and I'm not saying that's
Right.
horrible, but at the same time, it shouldn't be like this. Like you're in Hong Kong, you're where majority of people are Hong Kong Chinese. So how is it that
Mm,
your interaction really like deep? I guess would be the ones when you
mm-hmm,
start in university, where it's a lot more freedom to explore different things.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But
Yeah. Sorry, keep going. Yeah.
but I guess that's just the whole like kind of education system issue of Hong Kong,
Mm,
or just how systems are in place. But talking more a little bit about like Hong Kong and like like you mentioned a lot of like the class issue or like just seeing privilege and stuff. It seems like you have very well defined thoughts about it. So is it something that you have been thinking a lot about throughout your like kind of childhood and growing up that leads you kind of into like the job or like career you have now, where it's exploring those issues and exploring like deep
mm.
topics like that? Is there any correlation, or it just randomly happened, which we assume wouldn't be the case for most part?
Right. I feel like a lot of my ideas about this um, have come about in the last several years. I do think being in North America, a lot of these conversations around race, around class, around privilege, they're a lot more pronounced. I feel. Um, I can only speak for myself, but when I was living in Hong Kong, right before I moved to Canada, we all knew there was that undercurrent of racism going on, but we didn't really speak about it. And I'm not sure why we didn't speak about it more. I think we all assumed this is the way things were. I'm only speaking for myself. I probably just assumed this was the way things were, and we're not about to change it. We're all working so hard, trying to keep our jobs, trying to, pay the rent. Hong Kong's a very expensive city, so it was one of those things. We we just didn't speak about it, but we knew certain things were privileged, say in a job interview, in the workplace, in certain companies. As for the work that I'm currently in, I feel like becoming an immigrant as an adult is tied to that though. My own experience, dealing with documentation, filling out papers, trying to prove my identity, trying to convince immigration officers that I am who I say I am, and I'm here for the reasons that I am here. Which is just for transparency. I came here because my husband is a Canadian citizen, so it's through the whole family sponsorship class of immigration. That was very, very difficult for me. But I recognize in many ways I've still been very, very fortunate compared to so many other immigrants trying to get through the system. And so just to sort of rewind, my own, like, the work that I'm doing now is the result of so many twists and turns. I feel like anybody who ends up in media or ends up as a writer in any form has always loved and enjoyed books as a kid, and that was just me. So early on I knew I wanted to write, and I spent a lot of the first 10 years of my professional life trying to figure out where I could bring those skills, like what sort of job would be the right fit. And so I've worked for print magazines. I've worked as an advertising copywriter. I've worked for startups to do their content, do their marketing. And I feel like throughout all those experiences in Hong Kong, I realized I really enjoyed the storytelling part of things. Like with advertising was really fun, but the hours were not for me. So, and then I moved to a startup, and within that startup, I was doing many things, writing copy for their apps, their websites. But I also ended up starting their blog, working on the editorial side of things for them, and I really, really loved that. I really enjoyed that. So I that told me I think I should go back to editorial, which I did. I eventually started working for a magazine, writing about food, about wine. It was very lifestyle publishing journalism for me, those years of my work life. So yeah, I ended up doing that for quite a bit, writing about food, first for a magazine that closed down, and then as a freelancer, doing videos about food restaurant scenes in Hong Kong, and then another worked for another magazine that focused on like home and interior design. So I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed writing and telling stories. And then when I moved to Canada, obviously having to start over, I wanted to continue, I guess, in this field of journalism, of publishing. Um, and it was very hard. I found a job first as sort of like a content writer, but then I got laid off at the start of the pandemic, and that forced me to go freelance. And I remember figuring out, well, I really want to work as a journalist, and I loved lifestyle publishing. I feel like it's a really, really fun field of work to be in. But after spending so many years understanding what I enjoyed and what I trying to figure out what fit in terms of my own values and sort of the kind of work I want to be doing, I realized I should try to give news writing a try. In any case, I was freelancing, so I felt like it was very hard. I was very fortunate that my partner had a bit more of a stable income, so that's kind of how I fell into, okay, let me try writing about what I know the best. And as a new immigrant, how can I write about this community? So that's kind of like the thinking behind how I went into this part of, I would say, journalism and publishing. I remember this was the end of 2020, I believe. I had met an editor at that time who was very supportive of newcomers to Canada who are journalists and wanted to break back into the field. And he really trusted me with the story I had pitched to them. And I landed my first byline with the publication that he was running. And that really opened so many doors for me. The following year, 2021, I wrote a bit more about, different immigration, I would say issues, but also just stories. And and yeah, right now I'm not writing at the moment. I work as a copy editor. But I feel like in a nutshell, that's sort of how I've ended up in this line of work. A lot of trial and error in my 20s, and now I feel like I'm a lot closer to the field I want to be working in. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's perfect. And yeah, I from like how I know of you is through your kind of news reporting or news writing about like immigration issues or immigrant stories as a whole. Now that you're in Canada, being an immigrant yourself, kind of documenting like what struggles or what things you notice for yourself and also others that are like you. And I think that's really cool. And it's interesting how it came upon from you starting off and writing about food and lifestyle now to this is really, I guess, speaks to like in order to do well in writing or journalism is you really got to write what you know and what really like speaks to you at that moment, or it won't be as engaging and people aren't going to care that much because they can read the passion that you have for the topic. I feel, at least from what I'm doing, like for myself, like talking to people from the diaspora is really something I'm
Mm,
really passionate about, and I hope that it shows through the work that I'm doing. And I think
hmm.
you feel that in a sense with your own work as well. Like you're writing about what you're going through, and you're hoping that it'll help others like you to uh, solve whatever issues they may have, and help people, and it will help you too because you're writing about it. I think writing is such a powerful thing. And you mentioned like now that you don't do too much of like the news reporting or news writing, more in copy editing role. Can you just talk about like what is copy editing? Because I'm always curious about these words that I kind of think I know what it is, but not really, because it
Sure.
just the two words together, like you don't really have a good idea of what it is. So what is copy editing and what do you do?
Absolutely. I as a copy editor, it's a number of different things, on a very surface level. You look out for typos, you look out for grammatical errors and things like that. You want to make sure a story is packaged. We say that we call it packaged well for the website. So I work for the web team. And so that's everything from making sure the headline is reflective of the story. So that's one level of it. The other level of it is I think part of our job is to check for fairness in how a story is reported. Say, something happened, one person is speaking, but wait a minute, is is that the only voice that we need to hear from? Is it fair to, check in with somebody else to give comment on whatever is going on? Let's say a new policy that feels a lot simpler to talk about. A new policy drops from the provincial government, and they're talking about how great it is, which is good. But you want to try to make sure we paint a fair picture. So stakeholders, is it true that this new policy will benefit them? What do they think? So it's like a lot of checking for that fairness. Also checking for accuracy, making sure the facts there are correct. And I think on a maybe more artistic level, sorry, artistic, more around the craft itself. Like, it's a story like told well, does it flow? So those are the sort of things that we look or I look out for in my own role, sort of as a copy editor. Um, but that being said, because I'm working very closely with a story that has been written by another writer, I think part of the considerations I try to make is not to change too much, as long as it's, again, it's clear, it's accurate, and it's fair. Trying trying to find ways to keep their own voice, even though I'm helping them, continue. I'm helping them shape the story into its published form. Yeah, so checking the images that go on that story, making sure people are credited for their images, the captions are fine. And also, I think to an extent, especially now with, um, I think what I really wanted to say was, now with like COVID, and the pictures we're showing in a COVID story, are those pictures appropriate? I'm not gonna lie, I still see, in other websites, a COVID story, and the people in the images look like me, look Asian, and I don't think that necessarily has to always be the case, like massed up populations and they all happen to be Asian. So, things like that, just watching out for those things, making sure, the images are, first of all, accurate to the story, but also appropriate. So a lot of these things are the things we look out for, or I look out for, as a copy editor. Yeah.
That's really cool, and I think it's type of work where it combines all the stuff you would have done yourself, being a freelance writer or self-publishing kind of thing, where you look up for everything on your own. Because before you
Hmm.
had to do it, but now you're doing all this stuff that helping others, writers or storytellers, and like make sure everything is fine and accurate and fair. And I think it's quite interesting. Like finally, someone told me like what it really encompasses, because
Yeah.
it's always like, oh, it seems like you do a lot in regards to content or media or just like writing, but it's not technically writing, because if it is, then it will just be, oh, a writer as such, right?
Yeah.
I think
Hmm.
the word copy editing or copy editor is very encompassing of many different skills or traits that you need to do in order to kind of publish something out into the public, into the open, and really
Hmm.
something that I'm more interested in knowing more about now that I'm constantly listening to podcasts, paying attention to kind of any kind of content creator economy news, and like just podcasting as a whole. So
Yeah.
copy editing is something that comes up very often, or like content creating or like content marketing, all that stuff. So it's nice to hear your perspective on it. And
Hmm.
you say you're currently doing this, and of course you can still freelance doing other writing stuff as well. So I'm not making you choose, but in terms of what you kind of like, what is your kind of like lean towards? Like if you say like, what really is your passion in terms of storytelling, in terms of like topics, like what are the things that
Mm,
will get to you like, oh, I really really care about writing about this or doing this?
right. I will say, I think I am a writer first before anything else. I miss it, to be honest, miss spending a lot of time reporting. I don't do, um, I'm not currently freelancing as a writer. So I've really spent a lot of the last several months focusing on the new full-time job that I do have as a copy editor. But I feel like at the end of the day, I'm still a writer. And before this job came along, I was learning so much about immigration and migration just as an idea. So even the experiences of refugees, which that's a whole other world, and I don't, I can't claim to know too much about that. But those were sort of the areas that I was interested in, and for a while I was writing a lot about policies. But I started to just be more interested in, the other aspects of having immigrated or having moved to a new country. And I'm not writing about this right now, but I've been thinking a lot about like language, the way we use it, the way we lose it, and how it's a big marker of our identity. That's something I've been thinking about lately. Um, and I think another question that's always at the back of my head is like, how do we tell stories about the, the diaspora or the immigration experience that has nothing to do with policy? Um, but that being said, how do we tell a story and not just highlight the fact that this person happens to be, I don't know, a Filipino that started a new business? Those are great stories and those are important and we need it. But I think I'm also very curious. Like, I don't have answers for this. I'm very new to journalism as a field in Canada. I'm very new to immigration, so I have so much to learn. I don't know necessarily what I don't know yet, but I'd love to learn, and I'd love to be able to, eventually ask these questions and hopefully write about them. And again, I think what I was trying to say earlier is like, how do we tell stories about people who have moved to Canada? Um, More for their stories too, and less about the policies. Policies are important. I still care about those things very much, but I feel like there's so much richness to the stories that are there, that mm, are just waiting to be written or to be told. Yeah, sorry, I feel like that was very abstract too. So let me know if anything is unclear in there.
No, that's perfect. And yeah, I agree with what you said. And it well, to me and to a lot of others that are following your work, you're doing a great job kind of telling the stories and providing context and like doing all the stuff that we really look forward in terms of like reading stories about people in the diaspora, people are who are immigrants, so who migrated, because I think those stories are very important to get a sense of know what this country will be with more people coming, and just ourselves in terms of how we identify and how we look at our identity as a whole. And when I said you're doing a good job, I feel like that I want to know what to you is like important in terms of making sure you're doing a good job in terms of storytelling, and making sure like the people that you're spotlighting or like writing about gets like the respect and like be treated or like be spotlighted in a human way, because I think that's very important with a lot of touchy stories in regard to refugees or migration or just immigration as a whole.
Yeah, I that's a really good question. And thank you so much for your words. I feel like, again, as someone very new, I would almost say inexperienced in the field, but very enthusiastic. I think one of the things I learned very early on is that a lot of people who are maybe very typically described as powerless is not. I think what I'm trying to say is they may be powerless in the system because systems can disenfranchise a lot of people too, but they're never without agency. And by that, I just mean that I think, speaking only for myself and the people I have spoken to, a lot of people get caught in systems, not as a result of their own actions so much. Like I feel like it takes a lot of it takes a lot to move and uproot your entire life. And I feel like people going through immigration systems, I when they get stuck in a backlog, for example, oftentimes that backlog is beyond their power and control, you know? They did they did everything correctly down to the T, filled out all the papers, but then something in the system glitches or whatever, and then now they're stuck. And I think what I'm trying to say is I don't I am probably saying this because I went through the system, and I am and in saying that, I went through the system almost unscathed. I've been very, very fortunate. Um, but I can see that when we talk about immigrants who are, I don't know, facing a challenge or whatever, I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that they have agency in within their own sphere of actions and options. But then a system is also there that is probably I will failing them is a strong phrase, but maybe, yeah, maybe a system is there that's failing them. So I think that's one thing that's very important in when we talk about when I feel like that's important to me when I talk to people who share with me so much of their stories, to 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 make sure to point that out, that um just because a person doesn't have power doesn't mean they don't have agency. Um, yeah, and I think I am learning that people really don't owe me their stories. Um, I say this based on the experiences that I had freelancing, when I get very anxious because maybe somebody wouldn't get back to me by a deadline, or I can't find the voices that I need for a specific story. But um, I think it's also important to I think in saying that people don't owe me those stories, I think I just mean that when they do end up sharing it with me, that it's very important that, you know, I'm able to steward that well, and I'm able to reflect that fairly, in the stories that I do write, and that I'm able to be transparent with them too, in our correspondence, in our conversations. So um, those to me, I feel like are the things that are important in terms of being a storyteller or a journalist or a writer. Um, yeah, I did I answer your question? I kind of veered off track there a bit, but yeah,
I
my
think that's
bad.
fine. And I'm learning a lot, and I think I could apply that when I do interview people on the podcast, as I'm trying to interview people that might have more, I guess, special experiences or like just tough stories that we want to still cover, but want to do it in a respectable way. So it's good food for thought for sure. And
Mm,
continue talking about like your kind of journey in Canada, especially with like journalism. So, what are your thoughts on journalism in Canada, and also like your place in it? Like, even though you're not in it right now, specifically doing it, but what do you see yourself, your role here, as someone who is an immigrant, as someone who is a visible minority that's woman as well? What do you think about like being it, being that in this journalism field? Because it's,
right.
you could say, still fairly, mainstream, very Caucasian, very like majority culture, that kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a tough one. I think, as far as my current role goes, I think I am meant to learn as much as I can, and do my best as well around the stories that come across my desk, that are closer to me, maybe personally, that have to do with immigration and I don't know, other um, race-based stories, for lack of a better term. So I think it's just really important for me to learn, to also know what my blind spots are, so that I can also, you know make sure I don't make the kind of mistakes that would also upset me if I had seen them. But I guess on a broader scale, in Vancouver, I have to say I work. I work for a news company, so I have a vested interest in the field itself. But in Vancouver, I think I'm really fortunate at the moment that I do have colleagues that I work with a bit more directly that have a similar background as I do, which is helpful. A lot of the people that I admire and respect for the news company that I do work for are also women of color, and I'm so lucky to have those examples. Um, and I think, you know, journalism is a tough industry to be in. A lot of people say you don't get paid a lot. Um, and then there's a lot of harassment as well, a lot of distress in the media. So I think it's a tough field to be in. But I still have a very strong belief that the work that, sorry, the service that journalism provides is important. Um, I think we live in a time where we are all exposed constantly to information. And I think the greater challenge there is to how do you get people to care? We're seeing all of this, I feel helpless a lot of the time when I see, the deluge of bad news going on around. But again, I still do believe that in spite of that, giving people information that is again factual, um, accurate, and fair. I think that's still very important. And I still do believe that has a place in getting people to just care for one another. Not just for people right here in Canada, but people outside of our own country. And that being said, also here in Canada, a lot of our indigenous like neighbors here, and that's something for me too as an immigrant that I learned very difficultly, like at a museum. I can't even remember the artwork that I was looking at, but sorry, just to go off a tangent, I was looking at this artwork and it occurred to me, like, for all of the baggage I have against colonialism, and what I feel like it took away from me. um, Now as an immigrant, I am benefiting so much from that colonialism here in so-called Canada, right? So it's I think journalism has a place in telling those stories to remind people what is lost, what is gained, how things can be better, how things are so bad and how we can make them better. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, I have a lot of opinions about colonialism and all
Mm,
that stuff, but like, we can't ignore the fact that how I'm able to be here in Canada and all that stuff is because of that. And
yeah.
yeah, so it's about checking your privilege, but also like fighting for what you believe is just and right and fair. And like, we talked a lot about like your work being in Canada as an immigrant and all that stuff, your like kind of work life. So let's talk about a little bit like as we close off, like your kind of living in Canada life situation personally. Like, how has it been? You said you've been here for about 3 years now, so
Yeah.
everything should be like, oh, you adapted to a lot of things, or there's still some stuff that you're still kind of, I don't know how I feel about it, that kind of thing.
Right, right. I think um it's been an interesting 3 years. First of all, I am still trying to get used to the pace here in Vancouver. I think just coming from Hong Kong, it's a very, it's like a night and day difference in the pace of life. So there's that. The second part of it is two of those 3 years were spent like in lockdown in a pandemic. So, I think again, I recognize I've been very lucky. Like both my partner and I are able to work from home, so that's been great. I do feel like I missed out on being able to just see more of Vancouver or even more of BC because of the pandemic. And honestly, I wish I could. This is such a weird thing to say, but I've never actually spent a lot of time with my colleagues. Like, I started this job remotely and I've seen them for a full maybe 5 minutes at the least, and then maybe a full like 4 hours. And that's it. And that's only been twice that I can count. So I think in terms of adjusting to Canada, you know, I'm it's been good. I would like more of a sense of say, a sense of me being here. And I think what that looks like to me right now is having some form of consistency around the people I do get to see, the people I do get to work with. Yeah, but you know, that aside, sorry, work again aside, I Vancouver is a very different city from Hong Kong to me, and I think I'm missing a lot of the just a lot of the busyness, the harried texture of life that is in Hong Kong. But I really, really appreciate the mountains here. Like, it's just a beautiful province. It's a beautiful city to be in. Yeah.
So like definitely doing all right, missing Hong Kong, but only so much you can do with COVID and everything's happening in the world. And it's
Yeah.
a rather interesting time to be an immigrant in a new country, but not really able
Yeah.
to explore or like get the full like living aspect. I feel like because there's
Hmm.
so much you could have done. You could have had like a whole road trip all across Canada if it not for like COVID. Because I think that's what a lot of people who immigrate here can't have the opportunity to do so because it's
Right.
accessible if you have a car and you just go from and you see a lot of Canada and it'll be fun
Hmm.
experience. And but then that's kind of things I guess you can look forward to hopefully when things are a lot better and when traveling is less of an issue. And you talking about living in Canada has been good, which is I'm happy to hear. But like, are there like anything that you kind of like, oh, I don't know how I feel living in Canada? Like, oh, I want to say like negative, but like stuff that you were like, oh, I can't get over the fact that this and this and this or something like
Oh,
that.
that's so funny. Yeah, I say this and I hope nobody takes offense, but I wish stuff were open a lot earlier. I mean, up until later, a lot later. I'm talking about Vancouver specifically, where a lot of I'm pretty sure in Toronto it might be very different. Or sorry, in the GTA it might be different. I don't know what it's like there in Ontario, but at least in the places I have been able to explore here in Vancouver, a lot of stuff closed really early, and I'm not used to that. I think in Hong Kong, I'm just used to out being up until like 11. A lot of things are still open at like midnight, so maybe in some ways the nightlife. I think more seriously, what are some things about Canada that I can't get over? I I want to say that okay. Well, one thing I feel like I can say um, is that we I feel like there's a lot of tendency to compare ourselves to our neighbors, on the other side of the border. And I'm starting to feel like, come on, that can't be our benchmark. We're not, I'm only speaking for what I see and what I hear a lot, which is, oh, we're not as bad. Or I think in the context of, say, racial issues and tensions. Um, Personally, it's like, no, we have a lot of very real problems here that are not less in scale because they're less pronounced. So I think that's one thing. Um, yeah, I feel like this question can go either or. I can like rant and talk about the things that really get to me, or I can keep it light and talk about how a lot of things aren't open to late. But yeah, I hope that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, and to the point of like, oh, things not opening as late. I think, yeah, I agree with you. Especially like, if only I could deal with like, oh, things not opening as late as long as like say because it's not like in Asia where there's convenience stores that's open 24/7.
Yeah,
There's not
yeah.
really any of like that sort of to this of that scale here. Like
Right.
here, the comparison would be like gas station, but the stuff is not the same. A convenience store in Asia that's open 24/7, you'll be. I think if there's like convenience store of like Asia versus 7-Eleven or whatever, you'll be somewhat okay, even though yeah, other things are still closed late or early.
Mhm.
But like not
Yeah.
having that because I lived in Taiwan for a couple of years and like one of the best things I feel like Taiwan has is the convenience store. Like you can go there anytime and you can get
Oh.
something. Where in Canada is like you're at a loss if you don't get it during like the workday or like after like 8, then you're like
Mhm.
a-
Mhm.
and and I like your point about like oh yeah comparison to the people down the border. But yeah, it's something we need to like change our mind about like in terms of like oh we're not as bad, however it doesn't make us any better, so we should correct whatever we're not good at or good with. So if that means we have
Mm,
to address the tough issues, especially revolving around indigenous rights or
yeah.
racism or the social and class inequality, then we need to talk about it. Just because we think, oh, because we have universal health care, then everything is
Oh
fine and
no.
dandy.
Yeah, yeah. Don't get me started on universal health care. I feel like I've been gaslit by that idea since I got here. But yeah, yeah. Sorry. So just agreeing with you on those points.
Yeah, yeah, you definitely got gaslit because I think people just never really think too much about, oh, universal healthcare, but what does that entail? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of people, when we talk about Canadian universal healthcare, will get to the nitty gritty of how, yeah, we do have that, but we also have a shortage of nurses, doctors, and people always go to down to the north or down to the south for higher pay and stuff. So we lack a lot of doctors and everything's public, so therefore wait times will be long and all that stuff, and not everything's
Mm,
technically covered. Like, yeah, you won't have to worry too much, but also it's not that you don't have to worry yet.
yeah. Yeah, I know. It's this whole shortage is something that I care very deeply about too, because I think we I do think shortage is one way to describe it, but then I personally think I've seen and spoken to enough people to convince me that the shortage does not exist because they're here. They're just not permitted to practice. That's a lot of the things I've been seeing and hearing in the work that I'm doing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and one we didn't get into like all the qualification like transfer
Mm,
and all that stuff, which has always been the issue. So,
yes.
and it's
Yeah.
not just in the healthcare field; it's also in engineering, teaching, and all that. But
Right.
it feels like they don't care to like get it any like improvements because I feel like it's been such an issue since like the 80s when they needed more people come in. And when people did come in,
Right.
they're like, and especially now when like uh, we are always constantly talking about how Canada is like a country where we need immigrants doing jobs, but if you don't let them like bring in their qualification, then a lot of them will be displaced into other jobs that we need them to cover, of course. But then we also miss out on a lot of people doing jobs that they're actually really good at already.
Yeah, yeah. On that point, I remember, I believe, a professor. I feel terrible. I can't remember who, but professor had told me that what's happening is you get the cream of the crop from other countries, but then once they get to Canada, we relegate them to other tasks and professions. So it's like a brain drain for a lot of other countries, but then they're here not benefiting Canadians too. Like they're not here for the reasons they came here or they were brought here. So yeah, it's I feel like that is another huge conversation. We can talk about that too another day. I have
For
a lot to
sure.
say about it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I think we have lots to say about colonialism and all these sort of issues
Yeah.
that we can definitely have another episode about. But it's been such
Yeah.
a nice time talking to you, hearing your story and your experiences and your thoughts on a lot of the different things. And it's been
Yeah.
really great talking to you, learn a lot. And if people want to read what you have written before, where can they can find it and follow you for your kind of thoughts and feelings?
Right now, I am on break from Instagram, but if I do go back, I'm on Instagram at Johna.Baylon. And on Twitter, I am the same handle without the dot. So it's just at Johna Baylon. Yeah.
And then your website?
My website is jonabaylon.com. I need to update that. Yeah. But it's there if anyone wants to read anything. Yeah.
And again, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us such great insights. And best of luck to you and everything that you do. And enjoy your time being
Yeah.
in Canada. You know, hopefully you get to see more with COVID being a less serious. And yeah, enjoy your time and best of luck with everything. And on that
Thank
note, thank you
you.
for listening. And till next time, bye bye.
Thank you, Kyle. Great questions. Really enjoyed this. So thank you.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and share the podcast on your social media and rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can find us by just searching What Kind of Asian Are You podcast on Google and at What Kind of Asian Pod on Instagram. For the YouTube listeners, make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and ring the notification bell. Last but not least, buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/whatkindofasian. Thank you again, and make sure to tune in next time for another awesome episode.